This is chapter 5 of Stuart Little. This one is called Rescued. So, before we start, if you like the video, like and subscribe. Thank you. George was in favor of ripping up the pantry floor. He ran and got his hammer, his screwdriver, and an ice pick. I'll have this old floor up in double quick time, he said, inserting a screwdriver under the edge of the floorboard and giving a good vigorous pry. We will not rip up the floor. We will have to had a good search, announced Mrs. Little. That's final, George. You can put your hammer away where you got it. Oh, all right, said George. I'll see that nobody in this house cares anything about Stuart Little but me. Mrs. Little began to cry. My poor dear little son, she said. I know he'll get wedged somewhere. Just because you can't travel comfortably in the mouse hole doesn't mean that it isn't a perfect suitable place for Stuart. And Mr. Little just don't get yourself all worked up. Maybe we ought to lower some food for him, suggests George. That's what the state police did with the man that got stuck in a cave. George darted into a kitchen and came running back with a dish of applesauce. We can pour some of it in this and it will run down to where he is. George spooned out a bit of the applesauce and started to poke it into the hole. Stop that, bellowed Mr. Little. George, will you kindly let me handle the situation? Put the applesauce away immediately. Mr. Little glared fiercely at George. I was just trying to help my own brother, said George, shaking his head as he carried sauce back to the kitchen. Let's all call to Stuart, suggests Mr. Little. It is quite possible that the mouse hole branches and twists about, and that he was lost in his way. Very well, said Mr. Little. We will count on three, and then we will all call. Then we will all keep perfectly quiet for 3 seconds. Listen for an answer. He took out his watch. Mr. and Mrs. Little and George got down on their hands and knees and put their mouths as close as possible to the mouse hole. Then they all called, Stuart, and then they kept perfectly still for 3 seconds. Stuart, from his cramped position inside the rolled-up shade, heard them yelling in the pantry and called back, Here I am, but he had such a weak voice and he was so far inside of the shade that the other members of the family did not hear his answering cry. Again, said Mr. and Mrs. Little. 1, 2, 3. Stuart! It was no use. No one heard an answer. Mrs. Little went up to the bedroom, lay down, and sobbed. Mr. Little went to the telephone and called up the Berman missing person, but when the man asked for a description of Stuart, he was told that the only 2 inches high. He hung up in disgust. George, meantime, went down to the cellar and hunted around to see what he could find the other entrance of the mouse hole. He moved a great many trucks, suitcases, flower pots, baskets, boxes, and broken chairs from one end to the cellar to the other in order to get at his section of wall what he thought was likeliest, but found no hole. He did, however, come across an old discarded rowing machine, said Mr. and Mrs. of Mr. Little's and becoming interesting in this, carried it upstairs with some quite difficulty and spent the rest of the morning rowing. When lunchtime came every day, everybody had forgotten about breakfast. All three sat down to the lamb stew, which Mrs. Little had prepared. But it was a sad meal. Each one was trying not to stare at the small empty chair which Stuart always occupied. Right next to Mr. Little's glass of water, no one could eat, so great was this sorrow. George ate a bit of his dessert, but nothing else. When lunch was over, Mrs. Little broke out crying again and said they said she thought Miss Stewart must be dead. Nonsense, nonsense, growled Mr. Little. If he's dead, said George, we ought to pull down the shades all through the house. And he raced into the windows and began pulling down the shades. George shouted Mr. Little with an expressed tone. If you don't stop acting like an idiotic fashion, I will have to punish you. We are having enough trouble today without having to cope with our foolishness. But George had already run to the living room and began to darken it, to show his respect for the dead. He pulled a cord out of and dropped Stuart onto the windowsill. Well, for all the love of Pete, said George, look who's here. It's about time somebody pulled down the shade, remarked Stuart. That's all I can say. He was quite weak and hungry. Mrs. Little was so overjoyed to see him that she kept right on crying. Of course, everybody wanted to how, how it ended up. It was simply an accident, and it might happen to anybody, said Stuart. As for my hat and cane being found in the entrance of the mouse hole, you can draw your own conclusions.